Hi, my name is Peter.
Hi, and I'm Prasenjit.
We are product managers at Oracle working in the developer adoption team. In this series of videos, we will be building a microblogging application. The whole application will consist of a front-end website built with React, Typescript, and Tailwind, and a backend service and a database. Finally, we will be deploying the application on Oracle Cloud Infrastructure.
In this video, we will show you how to set up your project, install the project prerequisites, and we will start building out the user interface. By the end of this video, you will have a basic UI that shows the list of mock posts.
So let's get started. We will start by creating a folder called Microblogging App, where we will store the source code both for the front end and later on for the backend services as well.
Okay, that sounds interesting. So what is this npx thing that you're running in there?
So npx is a tool that helps you use the packages from the npm registry. Using npm, you can install and manage your application dependencies. However, if you use npx, you don't have to explicitly install the package. You can just run it directly. It's an easier way to run any of the npm packages. We're using npx and running create React app to create a React app called web that uses TypeScript. We're passing in the word TypeScript to the template flag on the command.
Okay, so I heard that you mentioned two different things that I have no idea about, and that is React and TypeScript. So Peter, can you just explain to me that what is React and what is TypeScript?
So React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It helps you to compose your UI from smaller and reusable components. We will be using React to build our UI for the application. Now, the programming language we picked is TypeScript, and TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. We could also say that TypeScript is JavaScript with static typing. Now, as we continue and we're building our application, I will call out some places where we explicitly use types and use any of the TypeScript features. So now that we've created the React app, we can use npm start to launch it locally.
By the way, so what does that npm start do?
So the npm start invokes a command that's defined in the package.json file. Package.json file, you can define multiple commands and script that you want to run. And we will modify that file in the script after we've installed Tailwind. Now, once the code gets compiled, the default React application will open in the browser on port 3000. So the next thing we will do is to install Tailwind and a couple of other dependencies that Tailwind requires to the project.
But what is Tailwind?
So Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework. What that means is that it generates utility CSS classes such as text center or MT12 standing for margin top 12 and so on. So you can use them directly from the HTML markup, and you don't even have to write any CSS classes directly or on your own if you don't want to. After we've installed Tailwind, we can initialize it by running the init command. This command then creates tailwind.config.js and postcss.config.js files.
So what are we changing now in this Tailwind config file?
So I'm setting a couple of options here. The first one is the purge option. Now, by default, Tailwind's size is around 300 kilobytes compressed. And this includes all the combinations of utility classes, even the ones you're probably not using.
So what does this do?
So with this purge command, what it does is we can pretty much remove the unused styles and optimize the final build size.
What about this future key?
So I'm also adding a couple of settings to remove the deprecated utilities by first setting the remove deprecated gap utilities to true and then purging the utilities by default. Now this will also result in a smaller file size. In the latest Tailwind version, some font utilities were renamed, so I'm also setting the standard font weights to true so we can start using these new names. Remember the start script you asked about?
What about it?
So we also need to update that script to generate the tailwind.css file that we can then reference in our application.
So what are you doing now?
I'm adding the build Tailwind script that runs the Tailwind CSS command and uses the input CSS file that we will create next to generate the file called tailwind.output.css. I'm also adding the pre-start and pre-build scripts where I'm simply calling the build Tailwind script. These two scripts will get called before the start and the build scripts are called. Now, this is just to ensure that we always regenerate the CSS file when starting or building the application.
So where is this tailwind.css file coming from?
Well, this is the file that we have to create now since we referenced it in the package.json. Now in this file, we will use the @tailwind directives to inject the Tailwind styles called base, components, and util. These directives are then swapped out at build time with actually generated CSS classes. Now we can go ahead and run the npm start again to make sure the Tailwind scripts execute properly and we actually get the generated CSS file.
So this is the tailwind.output.css file that was created by Tailwind and contains all of the CSS utility classes, right?
Yes, and we can now add the reference to that file and then remove the references and delete the other CSS files that we won't be using anymore. Having this single reference to the Tailwind CSS and index file is enough, and we can use the Tailwind classes across the whole project. Now we can also remove these other things that we won't be using. Now I know I'm deleting tests, but we will add them back in the later videos to show you how to write tests as well. So let's also remove the stuff from the app component and just add a title with h1 with hello in there. I'm also removing the logo and app.cs because we don't need them anymore. Now, the next thing that I'll do is I'll create a new component called home, and this is where we will be building the UI. Now, every React component you write, the first thing you have to do is you have to import the React library by typing import React from React. Then we have to export a function, and I'm creating a function called home, and just inside this function, I'm returning a markup that we want to be displayed when the component gets rendered. In this case, it'll be a simple div, and I'm setting the background to white, as well as setting the height of the element to be 100% of the viewport height. Now within this div, I'm creating an h1 element and adding another div element under that where we will show the posts and the create new post UI later on. Now let's go back to the app component and replace that h1 with the home component we just created. If you hover over the home component that has a red squiggly line under it, you can click the light bulb icon and select the option to import the component automatically. This will add the import home statement at the top of the file. Now, if you go back to the home component, let's add some styling to that h1 element, making the text bigger, centering it, and then changing the color to gray. Similarly, we're making the div element into a flex box and centering it.
Okay, so Peter, what are these mx2 and md12 in the class name?
So these are the utility classes that Tailwind uses, and mx2 is setting the left and right margin, and mt12 is setting a top margin for that element. Now, within this div, we will also create two more div elements. One will hold the create new post component, and the second one will hold the post list. We are wrapping both of these divs and then setting the max width to XL.
Okay, makes sense. So what does the XL stand for here? And is there a large or small classes as well?
So the XL equals to 36 rem units, and rem stands for root EM, and it's used to specify the length as the fraction of the root element's font size. So instead of fixing the sizes to pixel, Tailwind is using these rem units instead. And yes, there are extra small, large, and base classes as well. So we will create a separate components folder, and we'll put all the components in there. The first component we will start with is the new post component, and for now it'll be just a placeholder. Just like before, we import React and then export a function called new post and simply return a div. We can now go back to the home component and import the new post component. Next, we will be working on the post list component. This is the component where we will render all the posts. Now, let's add the React import and then just add this single div. We can go back to the home component again and just replace that div placeholder with the actual post list component. Since React is all about reusing components, we will create a component called post that will represent a single post. In the post list component, we will then render a list of these post components. Same like before, we import React and create a function called post, and for now, just return a div.
So we are creating all these UI components. However, where will the data or this post come from?
Now, eventually, the data will come from a backend service that will talk to a database. However, for now, we will just use some mock hard-coded data. Let's also create an interface that will represent a single post. This interface will contain the fields that represent a single post. Things like the ID of the post, the contents of the posts, date when the post was created, and so on. For each post, we will also store the information about the post author. So who was the person who created the post, what is their name, their username, and ID, as well as their image or the URL to their image. Additionally, we will store the number of likes each post got, the number of replies, as well as the ID of the parent conversation. Now, this parent ID will be used to indent the comments or replies to the post, and then we also need to store the actual array of replies. And finally, users will also have the ability to upload either a picture or a video, so we need to store the URL to that content as well. Now note that the interface construct and the type construct we used for the attachment type, for example, both of these are coming from Typescript. This allows us to strongly type the posts so we don't have to wonder which fields exist on the object, nor what their type is. Now that we have the interface, let's go back to the post list and create a mock posts array. I'll just paste in some mock data just so we have something to show up in the UI that will allow us to design the UI without actually spending time creating a backend or a database. Note that we will create a backend and a database later on, but at this point, we're just designing the UI. Now, note that we also have to add the type to the mock posts array, and the type is that post interface we just created. Now that we have the mock data, we can style the post list component. We'll create an unordered list tag, and then within that tag, we will iterate through these mock posts array. And then for each element in the array, we're using the map function. We will return the instance of the post component. We're also setting a property on the post component called post, and this will be used so we can pass in the actual post array element, the post that we want to render. Now back in the post component, we will create a type called post props. That stands for post properties. And within that type, we'll have a single field in there called post. Now, these are the properties that the post component will receive. And then within the post function, we can use the values from the post object that was passed in from the parent component. Now, you'll notice in the browser that the two instances of the post component are already rendered. One thing we forgot to add is the key attribute to the list element. Because we're rendering multiple elements in the map function, each one of these elements needs to have a unique key. And this key can be anything. It could be an ID of the post in our case, or it also could be an index of the element in the array. Now let's start styling the post component. In order to render the variables, or in our case, the text property of the post object, we can enclose the variable in the curly brackets. You'll notice as I do that, the UI is automatically updated. The first thing that we will add is the author's image. We're setting the class to rounded full, and this makes a nice rounded image. And for the source of the image, we're passing in the author image URL, and for the alt text, we're passing in the author's display name. Let's also set the width and height on the div that contains this image just to make the image smaller. We should also wrap the post text in a separate div. And finally, you'll notice that the post text is displayed under the image. What we want to do is we want to display this image and the text in the same row, so side by side. We can do that by making the parent div into a flexbox. Let's also add a left margin to separate the image and the post text a little bit. Now, the way things are right now, it is not really easy to see where one post ends and another one starts. To fix this, we can go to the post list component and then just add a border around the whole list first. Then, using the divide y utility, we can control the border between the post elements. You'll notice that as soon as I added these classes, that the border was added between the posts in the browser. Now this looks a bit better now, and at least we can see that we actually have two posts there. It does look a bit crammed together, but this can be easily solved by just adding padding in all directions. So px6 or 1.5 rems horizontally, and py4 or 1 rem vertically. This just gives the elements some room to breathe, and it looks a bit better. Now going back to the post component again, let's add the author's display name, username, and the date the post was created at. So instead of always typing post dot and then the name of the property, we can use the destructuring assignment and just unpack the properties from objects into their own separate variables. To do that, you can use the curly braces and then add the property names you wish to pull out of the object on the right side, which is post in our case. Once we've destructured the properties, let's rename them and also add the author username, separator, and the date. While we're here, let's also add some styles. Let's set the font to semi-bold, change the text's color to black, and add an underline when you hover over the author's display name, as well as we need to change the cursor to pointer. Later, we will update this to a link and then link it to the actual user's profile page. Now for the username, we add a slight left margin and then change the text to a lighter gray. If you're wondering about the numbers in the text and background colors names, they go from 50 to 900, where 50 is the lightest version of the color and 900 is the darkest. For the created add element, we can also underline it because later on we will use it as a direct link to that post. This looks okay, with the exception of the post date. It doesn't look very user-friendly and is hard to read. It would be much better if we showed the relative time instead of a full date. So for example, 5 minutes or 3 hours instead of a full date like we have it now. So let's create a getRelativeTime function and implement it. I'll create a utils folder and add a time.ts file where we'll put this function to. Now this function takes in the date string and it's going to return a string as well. What we need to do is we need to calculate how much time has passed between now and the time that the post was published. To get the elapsed value, we need to parse the date string that was passed in and then subtract the value from the current time. The current time is date.now. Now the result that we will get will be the number of milliseconds between these two values. Now that's the same reason we declared those three variables at the top, the milliseconds per minute, per hour, and per day. We can now compare the elapsed time with milliseconds per minute, and if the elapsed value is smaller than 60 seconds, we can display the time in seconds. To get the seconds, we divide the elapsed value with 1000, then round the value and append the character S that stands for seconds. Now, if more than 1 minute elapsed, then we need to check the milliseconds per hour and display the value in minutes. If more than 60 minutes elapsed, we display the value in hours. Otherwise, we just display the day and the month name. Now we can go back to the post component and call the getRelativeTime function and pass it in the created add variable to get a much nicer date displayed. Finally, we also need to show any attachments that there might be on this post. For now, let's only handle the images. Let's add a div under the text and then use the image element to display the attachment URL. Since not all posts will have attachments, we can check if the attachment type is set, and if it is set to image, then we can render the div with the image, otherwise we don't render anything. Now notice how the image in the second post shows up as a broken image? That's because that author does not have any image set for his profile. Now we can quickly fix this by creating a photo placeholder function that just returns a gray circle. Then in the post component, we need to check if the author image URL is set and render the actual image, or when the URL is not set, we can render the placeholder component instead. Finally, let's wrap everything in another div so the images show up in the same size. Now let's take this markup for displaying author's photo and extract it into a separate component. We will create a file called authorimage.tsx, then import React and create a function called authorImage. This component will take two properties, the display name and the image URL. Note that the image URL is an optional property, that's why we added the question mark. If the image URL is not provided, we will just display the photo placeholder component we already created. Now let's copy this component over to this file and then start creating the author image component. First, we destructure the properties into image URL and display name, and then we can copy over the existing markup from the post component. Once we rename the variables, we can go back to the post component and replace the old markup with this new author image component. We need to pass in the image URL and display name, import the component, and you'll notice the UI in the browser will be updated. The image looks much bigger, and this is because we removed the div that specified the sizes. We can add that back in the author image component. Also, let's set a slight top margin, set the cursor to pointer, and also set the image opacity to 75 when we hover over with the mouse. Later, we will create a link here to link to the user's profile. This brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we will continue building the user interface and add a component for creating new posts and implement a feature for uploading images. Thanks for watching.